Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We'd actually love to hear, where are you joining us from? So please feel free to join in the LinkedIn comments below and tell us hello from your part of the world. This week, Dave Russell is off, and I am delighted to share the time with 20 years. Have we been doing things together and yet never on the same screen? Please say hello, Jeff Reichard.
Hello, everybody. Good to be here, Jason.
So Jeff is another one of my colleagues at Veeam in our strategy team. Jeff, you have a rather interesting set of backgrounds, along with having known me for more than 20 years. You've been both an IT practitioner and multiple data protection vendors, and you've touched not only the commercial for-profit side of large organizations, enterprises, but also the federal sector as well. So I'm really looking forward to your experiences today and what you have to say.
It's completely true. You know, when I was thinking about this talk last week, when we first talked about it, I realized I did start out in private sector at a big university in California. And the first large project my team was involved with was actually redoing the financial systems for the university to make us compliant with federal accounting standards, because we got federal grant money and you have to be compliant with federal accounting standards if you get that money. So what interested me is that one of the points that we'll probably dig into a little more today is the way that private sector and public sector compliance standards are really converging now. They're coming together quite a bit in a couple of ways. And I sort of began my career doing that with the first big IT project that I dealt with. It was the same situation. So it's really moving along. It's been here for a while, but it's growing all the time.
Very cool. Now, our commitment to the folks on the line today is that we're going to kind of cover up our Veeam logos for a little bit and really just talk about the industry for its own sake first. And so take off your Veeam hat for a few minutes. We're going to talk about compliance and pragmatically, what should people be thinking about when it comes to regulatory compliance coming into, we're about halfway through 2020 and leaning into 21?
So I hear about two things in particular from customers all the time. And the first one is in line with what I just mentioned. There has been, in the past year and a half especially, but dating even before that, a huge growth in the different kinds of compliance frameworks that more and more of our customers are subject to. The job is getting harder, in other words. Mm-hmm. And the kinds of issues that we're seeing, everyone has seen the headlines. Everyone is familiar that Europe's General Data Protection Regulation began to be enforced last year. The strongest current US version of that, the California Consumer Privacy Act, went into effect earlier this year. And we've seen the results. Organizations are being fined for data breaches. They're being fined for non-compliant use of data. And things being what they are, even when they're not being fined by regulators, they're frequently being sued after a data breach, citing the regulation as one of the causes for the lawsuit. Mm-hmm. So huge initiative around that right now. If we look at private sector has all of the traditional sector-specific regulations that we're all very familiar with. You know, HIPAA here in the United States for healthcare, Sarbanes-Oxley for all public companies, SEC regulations if you're involved in trading securities. All those things are out there. So the compliance requirements are growing. For public sector, it's a very complex situation, and we have a graphic up here that's showing that. Public sector is focusing more than ever on security because of how many security threats are out there right now. And what's kind of interesting about what public sector is having to deal with is exactly like private sector, public sector is also having to deal with privacy regulations like GDPR. In Europe, some of the first groups in all European countries that were affected by GDPR were public sector organizations. The Bulgarian and UK tax offices both got hit. Austria Post for selling consumers' data to political parties. School systems have been fined for using biometric data. So it's not, in terms of privacy compliance, it's really, really not limited to public sector or private sector. It's crossing both. The interesting thing around this too is that for a lot of our customers, what they're finding, and Jason, I'm sure you've heard this too, a lot of customers are finding that their compliance regimes aren't just their own, but they're inheriting their customers or their clients' compliance regimes.
Yeah, when I talk to customers, and I don't have near the background in compliance that you have, one of the things I try to always iterate with IT pros when they talk about, oh man, it's another reg. How do you navigate all the regs? Bottom line is, from a common sense perspective, my feeling is that the regs are there because they're supposed to be enforcing behaviors that if you were a responsible custodian of your data, you should have been doing this anyway, right? You should have been backing up your stuff. You should have been getting rid of the stuff that you no longer need. You shouldn't be sharing your stuff with other people, right? I mean, these are things that the reason the regulations are there is because this is good operational practice.
That's
it just
exactly
so happens
right.
that we got to force people into these behaviors. And the two kinds of organizations that really have the ability to force an organization to do something, either the government of the sovereignty that you're in or the regulating board of the industry that you're in. But one of the two of them is going to force you to make better choices than you would have otherwise, because frankly, you should have been doing it anyway.
Yeah, it's exactly right. So I may be a law firm that has never had to worry about HIPAA, or never, maybe because I don't have a lot of European consumers as direct customers of mine, so GDPR didn't affect me. But guess what? If I have a client that is affected by those regulations, I get to inherit them. We have legal customers, we have consultancies, accounting firms, professional services firms that are finding that it is becoming a precondition of their getting business from their clients to pass security audits that are relevant for that client's industry. We also have legal clients, and this has been in the news as well, who have been sued after data breaches by their customers for divulging data, saying you should have been compliant with, the NIST cybersecurity framework or whatever framework might be relevant in that industry. So it's definitely broadened out. Interestingly, universities and public sector research bodies like the NIH in the United States have also been affected by GDPR, because if I'm doing research on human subjects and
Sure.
some of those human subjects are European, I've got to think about all that stuff too.
Yeah, if you think about the transitive nature of data, right? We're so used to, well, I'm an IT organization and I may choose to extend my organization's capabilities through whether it's outsourcing or consumption services or whatever. You need to understand that whatever standards you are held to manage your data or your people, it is reasonable that those will be extended towards your extended architecture, your extended ecosystem of delivery. And candidly, that's not just true for data. It ought to be true for how we treat humans and how we transact business and everything else. But that's probably out of today's conversation. All right. So that's the myriad of regulations that we're seeing. Is there anything in particular that you want to kind of drive us to? GDPR is a big one we hear a lot about. Can we double down on any of that as far as timing goes, those kinds of things? And penalties, you weighed into that.
Well, yeah. So GDPR has begun being enforced. The California Consumer Privacy Act has just gone into effect this year. And one of the interesting points that we've noted as far as preparation for California Consumer Privacy Act, the International Association of Privacy Professionals did 3 separate surveys of data protection officers and chief information security officers, so people specifically tasked with this. They did it last year in April, August, and November to find out from organizations, hey, how are you doing getting ready for the California Act to go into effect? What they found was really interesting. The closer they got, the higher the number of people who were confused and worried about how well they were going to do got. It didn't get easier as the year went on. People got more confused, they got more daunted. And if you take a look at how this goes, here's a visual example that I love. This is not from the California example. This graphic that we're looking at, build and operate a trusted DoD information network. It's a really wonderful resource put out by the Deputy CIO for Cybersecurity in the United States DoD. But it's wonderful because it's a visual encyclopedia of all the authorities and the sets of directives that folks need to be compliant with. But it can be a little daunting. The fact is, this kind of comprehensive set of regulations and controls and authorities you need to look at is meant to be an encyclopedia. It's not meant to be an atlas. It's not a map of the process you follow. And if folks look at this and think, oh, I just got to go through this, it gets pretty easy to kind of sink under the waves thinking I could never possibly comply with all of these directives and all of these authorities.
Yeah, for the kids at home watching on LinkedIn on something other than a 49-inch or a 55-inch widescreen TV, it is okay that you can't actually read the lines on this. That's actually kind of part of the point. And in fact, I've always been surprised over our time supporting customers around data protection. Most of the regs do not come out and say, and here's how to comply. You know, they talk a lot about what compliance should look like from an outcome, but method is still very much art more than science in a lot of these regulations along the way. Now, you talked about the progressiveness and the dauntingness of leading up to not only GDPR, but also the California regulation as well. And so regulatory compliance was already pretty daunting. And then the pandemic happened, right? Which kind of changed everybody's math a little bit. If we weren't already daunted, confused, and burdened before, now we got to deal with, oh, by the way, no one's working in the data center anymore. So if you are securing the data within the building, that no longer applies. We're working from home for the foreseeable future. Talk about compliance in the new normal.
Right. Well, I think a lot of us saw the recent quote from Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. But back in April, he said, we've seen 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. And his quote went on to explicate all the things that we're all seeing in our daily lives, right? Teamwork, customer service, sales, all of it is having to transform far more quickly than a lot of organizations expected because all business functions have now gone remote. So from a compliance perspective, there's 2 huge impacts for that. First, there's more stuff involved with my enterprise network and enterprise applications than there have ever been, right? Now, it's not just perhaps my phone, but it's my home computer that maybe I didn't used to use for work. It's my home router. Maybe I've gone on vacation for the summer, and it's my vacation home or rental homes router, right? The threat surface is much bigger than it used to be. There have actually been a couple of stories just in the past 2 weeks around major brands of home routers that have significant security flaws, including mine, by the way. I had to turn off remote administration on my router because it's not secure. There was one that came out just on Friday that basically says almost all home routers have some significant security flaws that you need to look at. Yeah, great news, huh?
Uh-huh.
So all these systems that weren't part of my organization's threat surface, they now are. The other issue is, so we're all working from home, but we've had to change not just where we work, but what we're doing. And Jason, I know you've heard that too.
Yeah, so how we're changing our roles, we've adapted to new roles. And again, I think I would argue that's probably part of the threat surface, right? So as you're changing different jobs, you're using all these new tools and new ways that you have, these tools have not been as tested. And as you know, your and my role, our primary role used to be go live on an airplane, go talk to people. And now we're doing these other kinds of projects with new tools. And from a training perspective, I'm not as versed on how to lock everything down and use those. So the threat surface, I think, is a huge challenge. And certainly for a lot of organizations that used to be, we're going to live everything within the data center, based on Satya's comment, a lot of us are using the cloud in many new ways than we ever have before. You've actually looked at what the cloud security context looks like from an attack surface perspective. Can you share a little bit from cloud challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we take a look at the second graphic here? So Flexera, a leading cloud migration and cloud data management company, does a big survey every year around the state of the cloud. And they look at what vendors people are using. They look at what sorts of workloads people are doing in the cloud. And what they heard in this year's survey is exactly what, Jason, you and I are hearing from our customers. Basically, the migration into new cloud services that the pandemic has forced on us is really outpacing the prep and compliance planning and introducing a lot of challenges. Security, governance, compliance, you'll notice they're 3 of the top 5 things that are listed on here. Managing cloud spend is another really significant one. It's significant, because even before the pandemic, that is in last year's survey, folks were spending on average 25% more for their public cloud infrastructure than they had budgeted for. So they were already having a real difficult time getting a handle on what they were going to spend on their cloud services. And now, of course, cloud use has exploded. Same survey, folks think that it's going to be up almost half again as much next year as this year. Governance, compliance, spend, and lack of resources and expertise, right? It's a real challenge across the board. And what's interesting, Jason, you just completed a big survey. Great job. Yep. Veeam's 2020 Data Protection Report. And what I was struck by in the Flexera report, if we go to the next slide, the kind of points that Flexera noticed in their State of the Cloud report were very, very similar to what you heard about from 1,500 worldwide unbiased customers in your report. Do you want to dig into that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and remember, this report was actually done. We ended in the last days of January, first days of February of 2020. So this is pre-pandemic. And even pre-pandemic, cyber threats was certainly the biggest challenge that most organizations were concerned about. Right behind that were skill shortages, right? So the inability to deliver these new technologies. And I would argue that that in some of the other data we saw, the primary drivers towards why we would modernize our IT or do digital transformation was in order to meet those customer needs. But oh, by the way, I don't have the skills to actually make that work. Right. So here's where that problem comes in. This was all pre-pandemic. And so now we talk about, hey, according to Satya, we've accelerated a couple years, but we did it a little bit blind because we're having a skills problem. Meanwhile, customer need absolutely is changing. That's going to open up that threats landscape even more. And yet, Mr. Reichard, we still have to ensure compliance of that data, regardless of how much IT modernization we've done over these last couple months. It's a hugely daunting task for folks.
It really is. And what's interesting, if you look at the list as well, people listed economic uncertainty and geopolitical uncertainty and industry disruption. And I think it would be hard to imagine something that's hit all three of those harder than the pandemic has. So yeah. our customers look a little prophetic on a lot of levels there.
True. Here's the good news. Because of the pandemic, because of COVID, we know that all the major government and industry bodies that are out there have said, you know what, we're not going to add any new regulations. Everything else is a status quo.
Oh,
no
right.
more change happening. You just worry about you, right? That's what's happening.
Sure, that's what's happening. In fact, no. What's amazing, specifically, since I mentioned before, there are a lot of organizations that may not even be located in California, may not even be located in the United States, but just as with GDPR, if they have customers in California, they were affected by CCPA going into effect. What's kind of funny about that, especially under the circumstances, is that the California Consumer Privacy Act was passed in kind of a hurry a couple of years ago by the California legislature. Since then, it has been watered down somewhat by amendments in the legislature in ways that some California Privacy Act advocates are not fans of. And there is actually what we could call CCPA version 2, a brand new act called the California Privacy Rights Act that is making its way through the ballot initiative process in California right now. It has an 88% approval rating. It has more than the 900,000 signatures that it needs to get on the ballot. In other words, it's very, very likely going to pass. And if it does pass, then July 2023, so 3 short years from now, that's going to be the law people are dealing with. And there are some big changes. There are some big substantive changes in what that'll look like.
But that's only, and you can't just say that's California. That's California plus anyone that has customers in California, patients in California, does business with any organization in California, does data service for any company from California. And oh, by the way, California is not the only state doing this. You've got a really interesting graphic of the 50 United States. that you shared during your Veeam On session. By the way, for folks at home, if you have not gone to Veeam On and watched the archive of sessions that came from that, Jeff did a really fantastic session around compliance. This is the pleasant view, the United.
Right.
There's a chart that you have that has all the regulations and then all the countries, and there's a lot more red boxes than green. And I can just count on the 51 jurisdictions just with the United States to start filling in those red boxes with green laws. And then there's 160 other major countries out there that are also passing regulations as well. But this kind of underscores how much change and flux there is in the industry, isn't it?
It's completely true. There are some bright points around some of the new privacy laws that are going into effect. I'll just mention one. Ohio's privacy law actually has an explicit safe harbor provision for businesses. And the law says if you have made strong good faith efforts to comply with one of the main privacy frameworks out there, and the NIST cybersecurity framework is one that a lot of both government and industry works to comply to, and you can show it, then you have a sort of affirmative defense if you are still unlucky and have a data breach. So it's not just the stick, it's carrots too, to incent organizations to comply with better data security and with better privacy. You'll notice if we look at this, California is still top of the list, right? It's the darkest blue, and darker blue indicates more regulations. But right now in the United States, it is a constantly changing patchwork of different sorts of requirements. And unfortunately, considering the current political situation in the United States with Congress, President, everything else going on, we are unlikely in the near term to be getting a federal privacy directive that'll make this easier for companies doing business with American consumers. So this is probably what we're stuck with for a while.
Yeah, one thing that I really enjoyed about your Veeam On session was the implication that you should not presume that, remember those wooden Russian dolls that you put inside the necks, and as long as you cover the outside, all the inner ones would fit and all that? You should not presume that the laws in your state are superseded or underseated, or somehow they will fit with the others. Wherever your data lives and whatever your data is around, has regulations specific to that. There's probably gonna be a whole industry that kind of brings up around that. All right, so I'm doing a time check. It's about 22 past. We should go ahead and do the rightful thing for Veeam while we're here. So we've talked about compliance for its own sake. You've been with Veeam year and a half, almost 2 years, right? And so knowing what we're working on from a strategy perspective and your lens on compliance, what are you most excited about as far as what Veeam is doing and bringing to customers and partners right now?
When Veeam as an organization had to get compliant with GDPR, we built some great smarts into Veeam, into our Veeam One reporting product, specifically around data locality audits. Where is my data? If I tag my workloads in Veeam, then I can see if I'm sending the backups of those workloads to places that I shouldn't. And that's been great for us, and it's been great for our customers around GDPR. It'll be helpful going forward. There's a ton of other great features built into Veeam that really help. It's worth noting, most security and compliance regimes have backup as an integral part of them. You got to be able to protect your data to be compliant. And of course, Veeam's been good at that forever. One thing that version 10 came out with that really helped in this respect is something called our Data Integration API. It basically lets you take all of your existing backup data and present it as disks to whatever compliance or data classification engine you're already using to make sure you're compliant with the regulations that apply to you. So basically, your backups become a really non-disruptive data source for your existing client initiatives that you can, compliance initiatives that you can plug right in. It's hugely helpful. I'll say one more thing. We have a great product here at Veeam called Veeam Availability Orchestrator. V3 of that is going to include NetApp support. It's a great feature around being able to leverage NetApp snapshots for compliance and failover. Availability is something people frequently don't think about in terms of compliance. But the fact is, under GDPR, if I get a data subject access request, I've got 30 days to answer it. And I don't get necessarily a get out of jail free card about that just because I happen to be down from a ransomware attack. or from a physical issue at my data center. Same thing is true for the California Consumer Privacy Act. In that case, it's 45 days. But uptime, availability are really key parts to being compliant, and that's something that Veeam makes easy to do.
So I'm going to comment back on those in reverse order. So when you talk about orchestration and the Veeam Availability Orchestrator, one of the things that I always try to point out to folks, I think one of the hidden gems in that product is the amount of reporting that can spit out of that. And certainly from a compliance perspective, to be able to audit what the steps are in your plan from a DR perspective. When was the last time that you ran the plan? How successful was the plan? Did anyone alter the plan? Compliance, I'm sure in some language, you take the letters and you move them around and it means documentation. And there's nothing that does that better than Veeam Availability Orchestrator. Working backwards on your list, the integration API. One of the things I am so delighted about, and if I was to try to give a word to IT pros, IT leaders out there, is don't just put your data in a backup product and wait for bad things to happen. Do something with your data. And at Veeam, our value prop, or part of our value prop, is that once you have your data under good and reliable custodianship within the Veeam platform, that integration API lets you unlock those pieces and parts. And what was your first one? Veeam One, right? So in fact, our colleagues, Rick Vandover and a couple folks from his team are actually going to be on Friday. They have a whole session lined up just on things around Veeam One. Rick, if he gets in front of anybody for 5 minutes, he will tell you, if you have not looked at Veeam One, it will tell you things about your environment that you did not know and that you probably ought to fix.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly. And not just your backup environment either. Yep.
No,
exactly.
No, your hypervisors, your core OSs, some of your storage. So please make sure to tune in for that as well. Normally I'd wrap up, but I want to give you a chance to one last word for anyone that you talk to as a senior level IT person. What's that last pearl of wisdom to share for today?
You actually alluded to it, talking about the documentation in VAO and Veeam Availability Orchestrator. The tough thing around compliance is that we IT professionals know what's technically possible and know what it costs. We don't always know what compliance problems we're inheriting from the big customer that we just signed or from the new regulation that just got put into effect. So communication is key. And whatever tool you use to do that, it is really, really important for compliance to get that right. VAO, as you just mentioned, Jason, really helps because the documentation is both living technical documentation of what's going to happen at a technical level, but for the business side, it also says, hey guys, here are the application sets we're bringing up, and we can include notes about why we're doing it. So communication is really key to get this right.
Amen, amen. All right, we're almost in the bottom of the hour. So on behalf of my friend and colleague, Jeff Reichard, thank you for joining us on this week's segment of Veeam Industry Insights. Take care.